All right, welcome back here for exercise 20 in your lab book. This is going to be the respiratory system. And so what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to use a series of images of the models that we use in-house, mainly because some of these models are bigger or plaques. Some of them are plaques and they are larger. So it's actually a little bit easier to show you where things are located in the anatomy and talk a little bit about the physiology as we go along if I use these images. So hopefully this is helpful. Again, if you ever have any questions, just let me know and I can always go into further detail. Maybe I can send some pictures or post some pictures with some labels for additional clarification. So this is always, again, an interesting system for many students, the respiratory system. Again, especially if you're going to go into emergency medicine. Airway, of course, is quite important. So airway breathing, right? Those are critical things that we need for survival. So, and just in general, you know, most people are more familiar with the respiratory system. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this lab. Not quite the same as if we had you in-house and we could, you know, blow up some pig lungs for you, but I'll try to do my best here. So for the respiratory system, the very beginning of the lab kind of goes into and talks about the fact that we typically will break up the respiratory system into two different parts, the conducting portion and the respiratory portion. The conducting portion is just like it sounds. It's going to conduct air all the way from, you know, the outside world through the nose and the mouth into the lungs. So that's kind of the conducting portion of the respiratory system. And so this is going to include both the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Those are both part of the conducting system. And so the upper respiratory tract, we'll get into here, is going to conduct air from kind of the exterior to the lungs. So this is going to include your nose, your pharynx, and your larynx, which we're going to go over in just a minute. And then that includes the lower respiratory tract as well as part of the conducting system. And that's going to be the trachea and the bronchial tree. So as we get into this, we'll talk about the trachea here and then the bronchial tree here in the lungs. And so when we talk about the conducting systems, some of the important things to kind of remember about the anatomy of these and the physiology as well is that they are lined with mucous membranes. And these mucous membranes have kind of multiple functions. So one, they are there to warm and humidify air on its way to the lungs. So that's one important function. But the other important function that probably most of you are very familiar with is that the mucus that lines, again, these airways traps foreign bodies, foreign particles. And the cilia will then, because remember, when you're talking about the trachea, it's lined with that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. I know it's all coming back around now. But remember the cilia that line that are going to be constantly beating and moving that mucus back up like a conveyor belt to move the mucus that's trapping, you know, any particles or bacteria, things like that. They're going to move that up to the back of the throat. So then you can swallow all that mucus with the bacteria and all of that, yeah, you know, all the particulates that are trapped in there. So I know that sounds lovely, but much better for you to swallow it and it to go through your digestive tract. And again, bacteria are much less likely to survive the stomach acid, right, in the stomach than they are to survive in the lungs. So that's why we have that system in place. So anyway, that mucus, again, is going to trap those foreign particles, and then the mucus will trap all those foreign particles and bacteria and things like that, pathogens, and then the cilia will move that mucus up like a little conveyor belt into the back of the throat and mouth and nose for elimination. So just a few important things about the anatomy of the conducting system to keep in mind. So that's all the conducting system. Again, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract are all part of the conducting system. Now, the respiratory portion, which is going to be inside the lungs, is going to be where the gas exchange occurs. So this is going to happen, and we'll talk about this as we go through. This is going to happen from the respiratory bronchioles, which you can't see here. Again, they're really tiny. Respiratory bronchioles on down. And the reason being is that that is where gas exchange is going to start to happen. So really in the alveoli, the alveolar sacs and the alveoli are the big portion of the respiratory portion of the lungs, because that's where most of the gas exchange is going to happen. Okay, so just as kind of a quick introduction, your lab goes through that. I kind of summarized real quick there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the parts of the lab just like your lab book goes through. I'll go through the upper respiratory tract first. So we're going to go through the nose, pharynx, and larynx, and then I'll get into the lower respiratory tract. So let's talk about the nose here. So here's the nose. To give the nose structure, you probably know it consists of mostly cartilage and then bone here. So that's your nasal bone there. And so that gives the nose structure. But again, most of it's cartilage, as you guys probably know. And so then when you talk about the nose, we have when you're breathing in through your nose, right? The first piece of anatomy that you have to know is the nostrils. We don't typically refer to them as nostrils. I know we always have to have some fancy anatomy term, right? So we don't call them nostrils. We call them external nares. So those are your external nares are your nostrils here. So that's where the air is going to enter. And then kind of this big kind of opening here is going to be called the vestibule. Okay, so this kind of big, nice, basically the kind of area that it opens into, the external nares opens into this big open area is the vestibule. And so air will come into the vestibule, is going to be forced through these narrow passageways. And if you can look, you have what's called the nasal conchae. And the nasal conchae are going to be these bony kind of folded structures, right, that are going to create these narrow pathways that we call the meatus. So the bone here, you have three kind of folds to the bone, right? You have the superior nasal conchae, the middle nasal conchae, and the inferior nasal conchae here. And what that does is that creates these three narrow passageways. That's what we call the meatus. So we have the superior nasal meatus, the middle nasal meatus, and the inferior nasal meatus. So why do we have these? What's the function of these? And so it may help, again, to remember that these are lined with these meatus are lined with mucous membranes. And those mucous membranes are, again, moist. So just like we had talked about before, those mucous membranes are going to warm and humidify the air as it enters. Also, again, so you've got a lot of surface area, right, to do that. Then you also are going to help to trap particles and pathogens as well in that mucous membrane. So that's why we have those structures, the meatus. So again, the meatus are going to be those passages that the air is going to travel in between the conchae. The conchae are the structures that are sticking out here. So hopefully that helps a little bit. So again, air is going to move from the external nares into the vestibule, into the nasal, through the nasal meatus. Again, the meatus are those passages for the air to pass through. And then that air is going to pass through into the pharynx through what we call the internal nares. So if you look back here, these openings that we have into, oops, I don't know if you can see my mouse there. You can see the openings that we have here as air passes through those meatus. Now, as those meatus open into the pharynx, we call these openings at the other end of the meatus here the internal nares. So these are the internal nares opening into the pharynx. So, and specifically, they're opening into what we call the nasopharynx. So this area here is going to be the nasopharynx, because we're going to talk about this area down here is going to be the oropharynx. So let's see. When we talk about the pharynx, again, the pharynx is going to be the next structure that we'll talk about. And the pharynx is going to include what we call the nasopharynx, the nasal pharynx. So let me see if I can get my mouse back. The nasopharynx here. And then it's going to include the oropharynx, which is, again, oro means mouth. So it's going to be the pharynx behind the mouth. Nasopharynx, pharynx behind the nasal cavity. And then we're going to have the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx is going to be here before we hit the trachea. So those are the three parts of the pharynx. So all of this back here is pharynx. And the pharynx is, of course, going to be lined with mucous membranes again to help do all those things that we talked about, warm, humidify air, trap foreign particles, and pathogens. And the other interesting part about the pharynx is lined with skeletal muscle, and that skeletal muscle is going to be important for the process of swallowing. So it is lined with skeletal muscle. The one interesting thing that you might see in the nasopharynx, so if you go up and look here in the nasopharynx, since we just talked about this not too long ago, here is the opening for the auditory tube. So the right and left auditory tubes open in the nasopharynx. And when you need to, relieve the pressure, a lot of times you'll kind of press on your nose and kind of blow. And that's because what you're trying to do is kind of force air into the auditory tubes and allow the air, the pressure to equalize so that allows the pressure in the inner ear to equalize to the surrounding environment. So again, you may do this as you're diving, or if you're driving up to Flagstaff, you may need to equalize the pressure. And that's why a lot of times holding your nose and blowing works, because it allows the pressure to equalize between the nasal cavity and the inner ear, because there's that opening for the auditory tube. So kind of interesting fact, right? Some interesting fun facts for your kids if you're going up to Flagstaff anytime soon on why you do the things that you do to equalize your ears. So the other thing about the nasopharynx back here is and the nasal cavity in general, the nasal cavity is going to be bordered down here by what's called the hard palate, right? So the palatine bone and the maxilla make up the hard palate. So there's the hard palate. We call it hard because it's the bony part of the palate. And so the nasopharynx is going to be bordered back here by the hard palate. And in the very back here, you're going to find of the nasopharynx, you're going to find the pharyngeal tonsils. So there's your pharyngeal tonsils way back here. So you can see some of the tonsil structures. We'll talk about the tonsils kind of a little bit later on. Not with the respiratory system, but at least you can see where they are. Then we get into the oropharynx. So again, the oropharynx is going to be down here. The oral cavity is going to open up into this portion, of the oropharynx. And the oropharynx is going to contain the soft palate or the uvula. So here's the soft palate that consists mostly of the uvula. The uvula is, you can see that when you open up your mouth and look in the back of your throat. You see the uvula in the center hanging down there. And the uvula is important because it helps to trigger the swallowing reflex as food, again, enters through the oral cavity and makes its way back towards the esophagus. So again, that's important because that uvula does help trigger the swallowing reflex. Other things that you're going to see in the oropharynx is you'll see the palatine tonsils. So here, this little structure right here is a palatine tonsil. Okay, those are the tonsils that a lot of times when we talk about having your tonsils removed, you have to have your palatine tonsils removed. So again, you can see those on either side. And then lingual tonsils are also in the oropharynx. So if you look, here is your lingual tonsil right here. So those are all things that you're going to find in your oropharynx here. And then your oropharynx usually ends right around where the hyoid bone is. So if you look here, here is going to be your hyoid bone up here. And this is right around here is where your oropharynx is going to end, right here. So here is most of your oropharynx. So again, right around, you can't see the hyoid bone very well here because it's, you're just seeing like a little section through it. And so if you picture it was kind of running around, the hyoid bone kind of runs around the neck a little bit like a necklace. So you're just seeing like a little tiny portion of it here. So that's why you're not seeing much of the hyoid bone. So that gives you your oropharynx. Okay, and then, so air again moves through the nasopharynx, okay, or sometimes in through the oral cavity into the oropharynx, and then into the laryngopharynx. So that's this next portion here is going to be the laryngopharynx here. And the laryngopharynx is going to extend, okay, from the oropharynx, so about here, all the way down to where the trachea begins. So past basically where the larynx ends. So right around here, okay? And it's obviously the laryngopharynx is going to contain the larynx. That's one of the big structures. Sorry, as my dog is nosing my arm here. This is one of the big structures that you'll need to know. And the larynx is going to contain we oftentimes call it the voice box because it contains the vocal cords. So it's kind of this cartilaginous box here that is going to contain the vocal folds. And you would see that it would be more of a box if we're going to talk about the structure. The epiglottis was closed over it here. So again, the laryngopharynx is going to connect the oropharynx up here down to what's called the trachea, which is down here. So here's your trachea. And so again, really the trachea probably on here actually. The larynx ends about here. Sorry, I was a little high. The larynx ends about here, and then the trachea begins here. So if I look at my cartilage, right? Because your larynx is going to contain this big structure here, the thyroid cartilage. And then some of your cricocartilage is where the larynx is going to end. So really here is where your larynx ends. And the larynx, again, is going to be important for a couple of reasons. So it's going to have this very, very important structure called the epiglottis. And for those of you that are doing emergency medicine, this structure is important to understand because this is what's involved with choking. I call it, if you choke, you have, in our family, we call it an epiglottis malfunction. So an epiglottis malfunction is when food makes it past this flap and into the trachea. So normally in the process of swallowing food, and a food bolus here, as that food bolus moves down, what should happen is the epiglottis should be triggered to cover what's called the glottis. The glottis right here is the opening into the larynx here. So, and you want, obviously, food to go down the esophagus, which is the tube right behind the trachea. So I don't know if you can see this any better really in this. Yeah, you can see this a little better in this diagram here. So here again is the larynx. Here would be your epiglottis. And you want this epiglottis to, during swallowing, to cover. And that's what will happen. It'll be triggered to close off the opening that leads to the trachea and force food down into the esophagus, which is right behind. So obviously, if if something goes wrong here and you have an epiglottis malfunction, food could get down here. Now, if you oftentimes you just cough that up, right? There's a coughing reflex and you'll cough that back up and then force it back down into the esophagus. But if it's a large object, it could actually become trapped in this opening in the glottis or the trachea. And that's where choking is an issue. So just kind of an interesting little fact for you. Yeah, my kids even now when they choke, they say epiglottis malfunction. So if you want to be nerdy with your kids, you can teach them that one. So then the other feature that we have of the larynx, before I get to where you hear, is going to be the vocal folds. So, and really there's two pairs of folds that we're going to talk about. The first pair of folds are called the ventricular folds, or also called the vestibular folds. So those are those top ones here. And the ventricular folds or vestibular folds are, again, they're going to be the most superior folds that you're going to see. They're the ones on top, the superior folds. And they're really fixed folds that are there kind of to provide protection to the larynx, also to provide a little bit of a barrier for entry of food and large foreign objects. But they don't have, they're not the vocal folds. So their primary function isn't involved with making sounds. So that's the vocal folds. And the vocal folds are the inferior set of folds right here. So these are the vocal folds. And they're these more, so the ventricular folds above are going to be these kind of more rigid folds, where the vocal folds are actually going to be more elastic. And those that elasticity to those folds is going to allow them to vibrate. So as air rushes past those vocal folds, the air will vibrate and produce sound as it passes through those vocal folds. And so the vocal folds also are moved by small skeletal muscles, and those small skeletal muscles will actually allow you to either increase or decrease the tension on the folds to help change the frequency of the sound. So that's the importance of the vocal folds and knowing where the vocal folds are, again, in the larynx. So that's pretty much the kind of the basic things that you need to know about the larynx. It's good to know some of the structures that protect the larynx. So obviously the thyroid cartilage here. This is the thyrohyoid ligament, and that ligament is going to help to really hold and stabilize, right, the thyroid cartilage. So that's why the hyoid bone is, again, important here, is it's going to help kind of hold that thyroid cartilage in place. And that thyroid cartilage is there to help protect the larynx and especially the vocal folds. And then you'll see below we're going to have the cricothyroid ligament. And then you'll see you have the cricoid cartilage. It's another thicker ring of cartilage here. So those are kind of the two major pieces of cartilage that you need to know there. And then from there, as we go down, that ends the larynx there. And now we're going to go into the trachea. So, and you're going to have the rings of cartilage that make up the tracheal rings. So again, air is rushing through the larynx, right, through that glottis opening, if it's open, through the larynx, and then into the trachea. So now the trachea is going to be the very beginning of the lower respiratory tract. So this is going to be the mark of the lower respiratory tract from here on down. And so again, you can see the trachea here. And the trachea, we're going to talk about how it moves down and branches even further into the bronchial tree of the lungs. Here's just another image of kind of everything that we just talked about. So if you want to see those structures, I'm going to post this PowerPoint. You can see those structures just in a slightly different model here. So trachea. So your trachea is considered what we call your windpipe, right? And that's going to carry the air between the larynx and then what we call the bronchial tree. Okay, so as the trachea comes down here, it's going to branch into the bronchial tree. And it's important to know, and you can see that in this picture here, and I just talked about it, that the trachea is anterior of the esophagus. Again, especially if you're talking about emergency medicine here. So the trachea is here, and just posterior to it is going to be the esophagus. So you can see that. And the trachea is, of course, kept open or kept patent by these C-shaped cartilaginous rings that you can see here. And these rings are what we call tracheal cartilage. And I thought I had an image. Yeah, here. I want to just go to this image here because you can see here these tracheal rings, right? So here's these tracheal rings. And this is nice too. This is a nice image because you can see the thyroid cartilage, and then you can see the cricoid cartilage right here. And then now we get into the tracheal rings here. So what's important is between these tracheal rings, there's a muscle called the trachealis muscle that connects, and it's going to connect the two ends of the tracheal ring in the back. You can't see that in this image because they are just showing an anterior view of it. But again, that trachealis muscle is going to connect the two ends of the C-shaped tracheal cartilage in the back. And that's what that's going to do is that's going to allow the esophagus, if I go back up here, into this image, that's going to allow the esophagus here as it expands a little bit. When you swallow a food bolus, that will allow that esophagus to expand a little bit into the trachea because it just has that, instead of having that thick cartilage as a ring all the way around, by having it C-shaped and then just having the muscle close off the C, that muscle has a little more give and will allow for a little expansion as the food bolus moves down the esophagus. So that's kind of an important thing. And then you can see as the trachea comes down, it's going to end in what we call the carina. The carina is the fork in the road here. So that's where we're going to fork into the bronchial tree. And that first part of the fork is going to be called the right and left primary bronchus. Okay. So now we're moving into the bronchial tree, and this will be kind of the last portion, so hopefully I didn't make this too long. But we're going to branch into the bronchial tree, which literally looks like an upside down tree. So if you look here, we're first going to branch into the right and left primary bronchus, okay? Then each of these primary bronchus is going to branch into the secondary, or what we call the lobar as well, bronchus or bronchi. So bronchi being the plural form of it. So we call these the secondary bronchi, sometimes the lobar bronchi, because they're going to bring air into each lobe. They're going to supply each lobe of the lung. So the right side is going to have 3 of these secondary bronchi. And then when you look at the left side, because we just have 2 lobes to the left side of the lung, it'll branch into 2. You don't see that as well here. I'm going to see, here's kind of a better model. So here again, you're going to have the right primary bronchus here, and then you have the 3 on the right side, the 3 secondary bronchi, and that's because they are branching again into each of the 3 lobes on the right side. So again, the right side of the lung is going to have 3 lobes. I don't know if I have a good image of that. Let me see if I can go back up, and I don't have a good image of that, do I? But the right lung is going to have 3 lobes, and the left lung is going to have 2 lobes. And I'm sure, hopefully, maybe you have a good diagram of this in your book. I apologize. I thought I had a better image of this, but I guess I did not. So you should be able to see that on your coloring activity there. That the right side again is going to have those 3 lobes. Yeah, you can see this on your coloring activity because they break it up. So if you look on page page 235, figure 20.5, you'll see that the right lung is broken up into 3 lobes. It's 15, 16, and 17. And they call that the right superior lobe is 15, 16 is the middle lobe, and then 17 is the inferior lobe. And then it's easy on the left side because it's just broken up into the left superior lobe, which is 18, and the left inferior lobe, which is 19. So anyway, you can see that on the diagram. Sorry, I thought I had one of the models that actually showed that a little bit better. But this out. Okay, let me go back here. Sorry about this. My computer is giving me a little trouble here. So anyway, we'll go back to the, so we have the primary bronchus branching into the secondary bronchus or the lobar bronchi. And then each of those are going to branch into what we call the tertiary bronchi. So again, here would be the secondary, right? Lobar, and then secondary lobar bronchi, and then it's going to branch into these tertiary bronchi, right? And now it's really starting to form the tree, tertiary bronchi. And then each of this, you know, I wouldn't mark this. This is good to know, but I'm not going to be able to mark this well on any of these diagrams. But this is good to know for lecture. So each of these tertiary, or sometimes called segmental bronchi, are then going to branch off into these bronchioles. And then each of these bronchioles is going to branch into what we call the terminal bronchioles. And so here you can see a terminal bronchiole. And then, again, this is where it's not depicted well on this, but the terminal bronchioles are going to branch into respiratory bronchioles, which are not depicted here. But it would be like here going into the alveolar ducts. And the respiratory bronchioles, starting here, would be the very beginning of the respiratory portion of the lungs. Remember, we talked about the conducting portion, the respiratory portion. So the respiratory bronchioles are the beginning of the respiratory portion. So there'd be a respiratory bronchiole probably here, respiratory bronchiole here, going into what are called the alveolar sacs. They're these grape-like looking sacs here. So here's an alveolar sac, here's an alveolar sac, here's an alveolar sac. And sorry, I left out alveolar ducts. So the respiratory bronchioles go into the alveolar ducts that each go into the alveolar sacs. So then the alveolar sacs contain all these little alveoli. So each one of these little grapes is an alveoli. Okay. So the alveolar sacs are basically like the whole, you know, cluster of grapes, and then the alveoli are the individual grapes there. If that helps, if that's a good analogy for you. So when, you know, if you were writing this down, this would be more for lecture, but it would help you for lecture. If I were doing it for myself to make the bronchial tree, I would just write out a pathway for myself that said right and left primary bronchus, arrow down to secondary lobar bronchi, arrow down tertiary segmental bronchi, arrow down bronchioles, arrow down terminal bronchioles, then into the respiratory bronchioles, then into the alveolar ducts, then into the alveolar sacs, and then finally into the alveoli. So I don't know if that'll help you out for lecture, but I might help you out to diagram that out so that you can kind of visualize that process. So again, you can see on these models, most of these structures, I believe I've gone through. Oh, one important structure that I didn't talk about, and I apologize, here is the diaphragm. So I didn't talk about the diaphragm, very important structure. And so this is this umbrella-shaped muscle. And so as you inhale, what happens is this muscle, if you can picture as it contracts, Right now, when it's relaxed, it forms this umbrella shape, okay? And when the diaphragm contracts, it's going to contract and push down so that it'll push down so that it's nice and straight across. And that's going to allow for inhalation, okay? Because it's going to allow the lungs to expand and allow, we'll talk about the pressure changes, for there to be a lower pressure as the diaphragm expands, and be a lower pressure in the lungs, and that will cause air then to rush from a higher pressure in down to a lower pressure into the lungs. So then, as you need to expel air, what's going to happen is the diaphragm is this nice elastic muscle, and it's going to bounce back up like this big umbrella, right? And as it bounces back up here, it's going to push up on the lungs and force air out as it pushes up. So that's kind of how the diaphragm works, and it's always kind of backwards of what people think. When the diaphragm contracts, it's actually going to push down as it contracts and allow air in, and then I think of it as an umbrella, okay? And as the diaphragm relaxes, it's going to relax back to its umbrella shape. So it's kind of like pushing up the umbrella on the lungs here. Okay? So that might help you out with your visualization as well, to see this nice umbrella shape of the diaphragm. And you'll see that when you, let's see, when you look at, I think, the lungs, and that's the last big portion of your lab, is it does cover kind of some of just the anatomy of the lungs in general. I don't have an image of the actual pleural cavity, but I am going to go ahead and put a link to a actual dissection. It's a cadaver dissection, a human cadaver. So again, you do not have to watch this, I know. So you don't have to watch it, but if you would like to, you can actually see the pleura, which is kind of interesting. And so remember that you'll have those thin serous membranes that are going to surround the lungs, right? And that will, excuse my phone there, that serous membrane helps to prevent friction, right? So as the lungs expand and contract, you don't want that outer tissue of the lungs to be damaged as they're pushing up against the rib cage. So you have what's called the pleural cavity, and you have what's called the visceral pleura, which would be the layer right around the viscera, the organ, the lungs, right? And then you're going to have this second layer that is going to go back and be right up against the right up against the rib cage, and that's going to be the parietal pleura, right? And then this space that's in between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura is going to be filled with serous fluid. And that cavity that's filled with serous fluid is what we call the pleural cavity. So again, this is very important to know in case, again, you need to know those important structures in case for some reason there was ever damage or air got into that pleural cavity. It can cause all kinds of problems. So there's that. Let's see. Then the other thing, I think you just have to know, I already talked about the lobes of the lungs, so we're good there. The apex, so the apex of the lungs is going to be the most superior portion of the lungs up here, so that would be the apex of the lungs. The base of the lungs is going to be down here. The most inferior portion of the lungs down here is the base of the lungs. And, the cardiac notch. Cardiac notch is the last feature that you'll need to identify, and this cardiac notch is going to be in the left lobe, and it's this little concave surface here, and obviously we call it the cardiac notch because it's the notch for the heart. It allows for the space for the apex of the heart. So that's your cardiac notch. And the other area that you need to know is the hilus. So the hilus is going to be this area here, and the hilus, I think I have a better image of what goes through the hilus here. I thought I had a better image of what all goes through the hilus. Oh, maybe I don't. Maybe it's in your lab book. You do have a pretty good image, I think, in your lab book. Oh, on page 234, you can see the hilus on each side is going to be one where the bronchial tree enters the lungs. So you can see where it's going to contain the right primary bronchus on the right side and the left primary bronchus on the left side. And then it's also going to contain two major blood vessels. So it's going to contain the pulmonary artery, and it's also going to contain the pulmonary veins. So that's where the pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins pulmonary artery is going to enter the lungs. The pulmonary veins are going to leave the lungs with the oxygenated blood, right? And that's going to be at what we call the hilus, okay? Also where, again, the primary bronchi enter. And so I believe that's it, except for just kind of some interesting, this is more, again, you don't have to know this, but I put this in here because I figured it might be kind of interesting for my few students that are doing emergency medicine. So a couple of features that you need to know in terms of if you are doing emergency medicine, you do need to be familiar with some structures in the larynx, especially the thyroid cartilage and then the cricoid cartilage. Usually right around the second tracheal ring, the second and third tracheal ring, you're going to find the thyroid gland. There's going to be a bridge between the left and right side of the thyroid gland, so that's going to run across there. So again, a couple features. Cricoid cartilage is here below the thyroid cartilage. You'll feel that. You can palpate that on yourself, and you could really feel those structures. And then here's the cricothyroid ligament that's going to be between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. And so again, you can actually palpate the thyroid cartilage on the kind of anterior side of your neck, if you can push your neck back. And you'll notice the big protuberance, that protuberance we call the Adam's apple. And what's cool is if you speak while your two fingers are, especially your index and middle finger, if they're pressing on the thyroid cartilage, obviously not too hard, you can actually notice the vibrations there, because that's, again, behind there is going to be the vocal folds. So, and here you can see there's the vestibular folds that are not important, right, for voice production, and then here's the vocal folds right here. So kind of interesting that you can feel that. You can actually feel the vocal folds vibrating there, right? You can feel the vibrations from that. And you can change the pitch of your voice while you continue to palpate and notice how the vibration frequency changes, which is pretty cool when you change pitch. So you can feel that, and then So you can feel the change in the frequency of vibrations. If you're doing the high pitch, you can feel the really fast vibrations, and then you'll feel the vibrations slow down. So it's kind of cool that you can actually feel that on your, palpate that on yourself when you're palpating those portions of the cartilage. So again, what's kind of interesting is if you want to kind of know just for some of the terminology, again, in this diagram here is the thyroid cartilage, and number 3 here is going to be the cricoid cartilage. Oops, sorry about that. Cricoid cartilage right there. And then down here is going to be the trachea. And so here, right here, this ligament is the cricothyroid ligament, right? Because here's your cricoid cartilage and here's your thyroid cartilage. So it's called the cricothyroid ligament. And it's here in this spot that if you were to perform a cricothyrotomy, or also called a cric, it would be in this area right here, okay? So what's cool is they show you the features to look for here. So you can see the thyroid prominence here. Here would be the cricothyroid cartilage here, and then here's the cricoid cartilage. So if you were going to do a cric, you would be right in this area here. So kind of interesting. And then if you were instead going to do a more traditional tracheotomy, the tracheotomy will usually be, what you're going to do is you're going to feel for your cricoid cartilage, and then you're going to feel for what's called your sternal notch down here. And right in between, usually about halfway in between the cricoid cartilage and then the sternal notch is where you would put a trach if you were going to perform a tracheotomy. Here would be where you would insert the trach tube. So just kind of interesting. I thought some of you might enjoy that anatomy. You can see that on here as well, and all these structures on. This is kind of cool because it shows the hyoid bone, the thyrohyoid ligament that's holding the thyroid cartilage in place, and then here's the cricothyroid ligament that we just talked about where you'd cric. And then here's the cricoid cartilage, and here's your tracheo rings here. So just interesting for your anatomy for those of you that are doing some emergency medicine. And when you do each of those types of, and who does those, will be talked about in your emergency medicine class. So I'll save that for them. All right, thank you guys very much. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns on this, and I will see you next time.